To understand how a system collapses, you must first see how it reached its peak. Before the chaos, the collapse, and the first recorded dark age in history, there was a glorious order. We call it the Late Bronze Age. It sounds like a boring textbook title, doesn't it? But forget that name. This was the real world of Homer's Iliad, the setting of its heroes and legends. We aren't talking about the Trojan horse or Agamemnon. We are talking about real kings, real empires, and their breathtaking wealth. This was the world of the Hittites, masters of Anatolia, the world of the Mycenaeans, the bronze-armored warriors of Greece, and the world of the Egyptian New Kingdom, ruled by living gods like Ramses the Great. And let me tell you, these were not primitive tribes living in caves. They were complex, global superpowers, no different from the modern world. So much so that in their letters to one another they called each other brother. This wasn't just a courtesy. It was a prehistoric United Nations system, an acknowledgement that they were all equal and sovereign powers. They built a civilization so complex, so wealthy, and so stable, they could never have imagined it would all burn to the ground in just 50 years. Our story begins around 1300 BCE. If you were a traveler in the Eastern Mediterranean, you would be witnessing the peak of human civilization up to that point. And the name of that peak was globalization. Yes, the very thing we thought we invented in the 21st century already existed 3,000 years ago. The engine of this world was trade, and the lifeblood of that trade was the metal that gave the age its name: bronze. Now, we need to understand just how critical bronze was. It was the steel, the oil, and the uranium of its day. Your farming tools, your shields, your swords, everything was bronze. You could not be an empire without bronze. And to make bronze, you needed two things: copper and tin. Copper was easy. There was plenty of it on Cyprus. But tin was a nightmare. The nearest major source was thousands of kilometers away, in the mountains of Afghanistan. Think about it. The tin needed for a pharaoh's sword in Egypt had to cross deserts, mountains, and dangerous seas. What does that imply? It implies international maritime law, insurance policies, complex supply chains, and military protection agreements between kings. The proof? The Uluburun shipwreck found off the coast of Turkey in 1982. This ship was like a gift box from that world. It wasn't just carrying 10 tons of copper and 1 ton of tin. It had Mycenaean pottery, Egyptian ebony, Nubian ivory, Baltic amber, and even a solid gold seal bearing the name of Queen Nefertiti. This single ship was the floating proof of just how wealthy, how connected, and how modern they were. This wealth fueled a system known as the palace economy. Everything, grain, metal, and luxury goods, was collected at central palaces and distributed by a massive army of bureaucrats. This was incredibly efficient, but it was also terrifyingly fragile. Everything depended on the palace, which meant everything depended on the king. And this wealth was in the hands of three main powers. In the north, in the rocky heart of Anatolia, were the Hittites. From their capital, Hattusa, they ruled a vast empire built on iron and stone. They were the balancing power, a disciplined military society, feared for their iron weapons and their fast war chariots. Their culture was known as the people of 1,000 gods. They adopted the gods of every people they conquered. This was less about tolerance and more about a spiritual glue to hold the empire together. They had their gods witness their treaties. For them, a treaty was sacred. If it weren't for the Hittites, Egypt probably would have swallowed the entire Middle East. In the south, of course, there was Egypt, ancient, magnificent, and arrogant. Egypt wasn't just a kingdom. It was a brand, a cultural superpower. The pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was a living god on earth, his power absolute, and his treasuries overflowed with the bounty of the Nile and the gold of Nubia. Egypt's worldview was simple. There was Egypt, order, and there was everyone else, chaos. They were used to the predictable flooding of the Nile for thousands of years. For them, change was a terrifying concept. The only thing they wanted was ma'at, cosmic balance and stability, and in the west, across the Aegean Sea, lived the Mycenaeans, the legendary Greeks of the Trojan War. But don't think of them as a single empire. The Mycenaean world didn't have the central authority of the Hittites or Egyptians. They were more like a group of rich, feuding palace states run like mafia families. Each hilltop was ruled by a wanex, a lord, and these lords were in constant competition. They buried their wealth in massive tholos tombs. Their culture was built on war, honor, and plunder. The arrogant, quick-to-anger heroes described by Homer are a perfect portrait of these Mycenaean palace lords. They were the system's merchants, its sailors, but also its pirates. For centuries, these three great powers lived in a delicate balance. When you read the clay tablet letters that survive, it's shocking. They are no different from modern diplomats. "Brother, why did you send me less gold? I will marry my sister to your son. But what will I get in return?" This was high-level geopolitical chess. The kings felt invincible. Their systems worked perfectly. In their minds, this order would last forever. But this is where the story turns dark. Their golden age was built on an incredibly fragile foundation. It was a magnificent machine, but it was like a Swiss watch. If a single gear broke, the entire machine would stop. And what were those gears? Trust, the tin route from Afghanistan, and most importantly, the grain ships from Egypt and the Black Sea steppes. The population had grown so large that without this imported food, the cities would starve. They had a blind faith that the climate would always be stable. The system was designed for good days. They had no plan for bad days. Their societies were dependent on the constant flow of food. Their armies were dependent on the constant flow of bronze. Their systems were dependent on the unshakable belief that everyone would do their part. This system had no flexibility to handle a major shock, like an earthquake, a famine, or an invasion. And as the 13th century BCE came to a close, that shock was approaching. A shadow had appeared on the horizon in the west. A new people, unknown, appearing at the edges of their perfect world. They came from the sea, and they were the grain of sand falling into the gears of this perfect Swiss watch. They stopped everything. The Bronze Age wasn't just a time period. It was a system, and that system was about to be completely erased from the face of the earth. This was the story of its collapse. Subscribe to the Shard of History. In the next episode, we get closer to the question historians still can't answer. Who were the Sea Peoples?